The boy who lived has come to die. Oh, good job. Greetings to all today's students. Welcome back for another riveting lesson of what ridiculous franchise can we stick together and pop out the other end with some FromSoftware sprinkled on top. On today's curriculum, we're pitting the most powerful wizard in Harry Potter against the massive marble-brained sorcerer from Elden Ring, Master Lusat. And between these two fighting, we're going to have a glintstone sorcerer getting absolutely decimated. So let's just crack on. I'm hopped up on espresso and ready to go. And to start building this piece, we got to conjure up our prince from the Outer Realm. So, pay attention and watch and learn. That's not quite working. There we are, it's all in the enunciation, children. So now that we have our print, we can take a closer look at what we've got. And in the blue corner, representing House Rea Lucaria, we have Master Lusat, brought forth by Professor Realstein. Be sure to check out their Patreon for more Lands Between Witchcraft. And in the green corner, representing House Slithering In, we've got Baldy Voldemort. And in the middle of the wild wizarding war, we will also be seeing an appearance from the double-headed, belligerent, book-slapping bastard, this glintstone sorcerer. And finally, the big old trouser snake of death, Panini Nagini. To begin, I'll just get some green stuff putty slapped over these prints to fill any glaring gaps or holes before we whack on a layer of primer. I printed Lusat's big marble head separately from the rest of him so I can sand it down with very fine grit sandpaper and produce a very smooth and shiny ball. So I'll start off by sanding it all over with some medium to high grit sandpaper, around about 300 to 400, and I'll slowly work up into the higher numbers like the 2000s and the 3000s, whilst also dropping some dabs of water to do some wet sanding on it. And at the end of this process, you should get the smoothest balls in all of Elden Ring. Now we have our dueling wizards sorted, we'll get them each primed black. Primus Blackus! My idea for this piece is to make a big wizard lightning battle with each wizard at either end, and the poor unfortunate glintstone sorcerer will be caught in the middle getting bloody blown to bits. So onto this chunk of wood I'm going to stick down a perfectly cut shaped slab of foam, and then hack away at it with a hot wire cutter to roughen up these sharp edges. Then some fancy weights to keep the foam firmly pressed down onto the wood to keep it set in place. Once dried, I'll grab some hodgepodge Mod Podge, mix it into a magical mess with some black paint, and start slapping it all over the foam. The Mod Podge will seal and protect the foam, and the black paint will do the impressive job of painting it black. With the holy moly Mod Podge drying on the side, I'll whack out my hot wire cutter and start creating some flat fiddly flagstones, as I want my little dueling area to be some kind of vague, ruined courtyard. I don't really know yet, but flagstones look pretty cool. Now that I have a fabulous flagstone collection, I'll grab an empty tub of ice cream and fill it with the best rock texture implement a crafter can buy. Rocks. And then just shake the ever-loving fuck out of it. The rocks will beat the crap out of the foam and bash in all the sharp edges, giving it a roughened up stony texture. And I did that once, twice, thrice, quice, kice, sice? Words. With the bruised and battered bricks swept to one side, we'll grab some glue and goop it on all over the base. And then we can get all of our flagstones put in place to create our nondescript courtyard. I left some bits blank as I want to fill it with a bit of nature later. They're still a bit too prim and proper, so I'll pick and peel away at them with a sharp knife to give them some decent battle scarring wear and tear. Next on the list is to load up another round of holy moly hodgepodge Mod Podge onto the flagstones to seal them off and prime them. I'll then begin painting them, starting off with a little dry brushing of white on each individual slab. Normally I would just do a big wide dry brush over all of it, but I want them to look a bit more individual, so I'm going to go the long route and do them one by one. After the first dry brush layer, I'll whack on a thinned down bone tone contrast paint all over it to give it that nice browny beigey tone. With the contrast dried, I'll do a pass of dusty light sand tone all over the slabs, then a highlight pass of brighter bone tone over that, then a highlight pass of brighter bone tone over that, then another pass of even brighter dry brushed highlights over that. Bring it all down with a very thin brown wash to tie it together and seep into all the recesses and cracks. And then a final highlight to the edges will finish off our lovely battle-worn flagstone area. Next up, I'll grab a dollop of earth texture and start filling in these blank spots. I've left some big gaps in between some of the flagstones as well, so that I can get some grass growing up between the cracks and make it look a bit overgrown. As the mud dries, I'll add some extra character to these stones by stippling on a thin layer of brown to give it a bit of dirt. Once the brown has gone to town and back again, I'll add a final dash of character to each block by sloshing over a very thin layer of green shade to give it a green shade. I'll squirt some thin basing glue into all the gaps and cracks, and then start filling them in with some static grass from my static grass applicator. I filmed this in a high FPS so I can give you some super sexy slow-mo static grass shots. Once you've had a moment to recover from that sultry static grass section, I'll begin stuffing these cracks with some tufts of similar coloured grass to make it look a bit more interesting all round. With the grass portion of the base done, we can leave it all to dry for a solid while and we can move on to painting our Wizard Lightning Battle Maniacs. On top of our Primus Blackus Crackhead, we'll do a pass of Zenithal Highlight to give us some strong base shade to build our layers on top of. We'll do the same for the Horcrux Harry Hater and his massive snake as well. Now, to start with the Mad Marblehead, I'll get his cloak based with a grey contrast paint. These paints are great to work with on top of Zenithal highlights as they retain the shade job underneath. I'll pop some brown contrast paint onto his front flap here, and then a layer of bone tone contrast onto all of the other wraps around his head and his wrists. A little basing of blue will go over all of the crystals, and then a very thin glaze of dark blue over his massive shiny dome. I'll pop some silver metallics onto his medallions and base his skin with some pasty pinky skin tone. And there's our big bassy boy ready for his highlight job. I'll add layers of progressively lighter greys onto the feathers and cloak, drawing it outwards to create a strokey, feathery look to each layer, and hopefully it will build up a nice amount of texture and contrast. So the cloak is done and we can move on to his front flap. I'll start by adding a nice medium brown to give our contrast base a bit more depth. As that dries, I'll hop around and add some lighter beige tones to the wraps to also give them a bit of depth, and then a little tickling of Nuln Oil over his metallic pieces to give them some much needed glossy contrast. Now that we're facing his front flap, I'm met with the realization that it has an insane amount of intricate detailing all over it, which I'm really not looking forward to doing. So I'll crudely try and match the design with a bit of creative licensing thrown in to the best my limited ability will allow. Doing the design in white means I can go over it with a thin layer of gold, which should hopefully help it stand out against the brown and make it seem a bit more refined. One evening and one strained carpal tunnel wrist later, we have a happy little Lusat. Next up, we need to paint the big marble eyeball that sits on his head. I'm going to go through progressively brighter shades of blue and do this kind of outward stroke thing starting from the middle to give us a blue-eyed Sauron look. With all the layers of dark to light blues added in, I'll add a thin smoky black streak in the middle for that Jurassic Park pupil effect. A dollop of UV resin onto the head will give us that extra bit of shine and glossiness to it. Last but not least for Lusat, we need to try our hand at doing a crystal effect to all his lovely little Crash Bandicoot crystals across his shoulders. Now, I did do a lot of research into how crystals reflect light and how that can be mimicked on a miniature. And I found this very informative video from Vince Venturella, who gives a bit of a deep dive into how to achieve the look. I would recommend giving him a watch, as I'll probably butcher the explanation and give myself a big fat headache in the process.
My aching head.
So after a solid session of smashing some blue crystals, I have myself a complete and proper Breaking Bad sorcerer.
Yes! Hell yeah! Hey, come on, baby! Come on!
I finished it off by replicating the same crystal methods to his staff. So now I can get Baldy Boy and his snake painted up. His cloak is entirely grey, so I'll go with the same method as Lusat and base it with a grey contrast paint. His big shiny head will get a dull, lifeless, pale skin tone all over it, then just a sprinkle of brown over his wand. Same as before, I'll gradually add thin layers of progressively lighter greys to build up a nice grey contrast. To smooth out the transitions of the differing shades, I'll go over it with a couple applications of some glazing. After a good while of doing the same thing over and over and over again, you'll get a cool contrasty look. I'll throw some shade at his face to give it some darker tone, then gradually build up some brighter tones to his skin to an almost off-white colour to really enhance that dull, lifeless, smooth head of his. And after all that, we have our dueling banjo boys ready for battle. We'll wrap up the painting with the reptilian villain, and I mix together a brown and green contrast paint to give us this kind of orcish lizard green as a nice base colour. Its gums will get a pinky tone and the teeth will get a toothy tone. The eyes will get a big scary yellow colour with a little black slit for its pupils. Then I'll dry brush on some differing shades of yellows, browns and greens to give it that patchy, scaly vibe, and add a bit of depth and variation across the skin. To finish off, I'll dollop a thin green oil shade to tie the tones together and give us a bit of contrast in the textures. Now for the glintstone bastard. Previously, I've done some weird and traumatizing things to my models in order to break them apart, so I won't put you through that again, and instead this time, I'll make it quick and painless.
Lovely.
With all these broken pieces, I'll just prime the insides black so we don't get any weird grey colour poking through. With that sorted, I'll mix together some oohoo and some red contrast paint to give us a sticky bloody mess, which I'll use to sell the effect of him being ripped apart by the wizard duel. To have all his bits flying out from his body, I'll use some thin armature wire to attach and position each bit. Once each piece has been attached to its own strand of thin wire, I'll stretch some oohoo glue out across it to give that horrid ripping sensation. His hand holding his staff and the other one holding the bashing book will have their own little wires separate from the body. And to finish off this bit, I'll just add a small bit of red contrast paint to the remaining glue. There is our hideous creation. Now to piece it together onto the base, I realised I jumped the gun by gluing the foam to the wood so early on, so that means that I can't put the explodey boy in place and hook up any lighting without great difficulty. So I have to cut the foam from the wood and pry it off before we can start doing anything else. With the foam free from its wooden shackles, I can begin placing everything into position. The armature wire means I can easily fasten the sorcerer to the base and still have the flexibility to move him around if need be. To power everything, I need a little 3-volt battery sitting underneath, with a little switch on top. So I'll poke the wires and the switch through from the bottom, and then the wires can go back down under, leaving the switch on top and allowing us to do all of the necessary connections underneath. So for the actual Wizard Lightning battle, I grabbed some of these weird flexible noodle LEDs off of AliExpress. I've never ordered anything off of that site before, and it made me very nervous, but I'm actually pretty pleasantly surprised with how amazing these lights actually are. You can see they're insanely flexible when you hook them up to a 3-volt battery, and they're also crazy bright. To attach these noodles to a noodle power supply, I got these super fine red and black wires which can attach to the positive and negative side of the noodle and then into the battery. I'll strip the wire to expose the metal centre, and the positive end to the noodle has this little hole which is the perfect size to poke our wire through, and I'll just wrap that around nice and tight to keep it in place before soldering. The negative end doesn't come with a little hole, so I just have to tie it around super tightly. When you connect the two wires to a battery, you get light. Now, I spent a good while working out how to make a noodle a bit more rigid so that I can bend it to form a shape that looks a bit more like a spell being cast, as it is a bit too floppy in its current state and we need to stiffen it up a bit. So I thought I would take this thin metal wiring again and hook it onto the negative end of the noodle and clamp it in place. Then I'll twist it around the negative black wire to form a thicker wire. The metal wire will give it a bit of rigidity to the noodle so that I can bend it all to shape. To keep the wire attached to the noodle and form a little noodly spine, I'll wrap some super thin fishing line around it and super glue the ends in place. I can then tie the 2 core wires together for tidiness sake. Then, to give it some ooey gooey spell magic, I'll use some of this clear silicone and start squirting it down the wire, pulling and prodding it around to give us this weird wispy texture. Once it dries, it'll also give a bit more density and rigidity for when I come to shape it. And one last little test to make sure I haven't broken anything. And once I'm happy all the wiring is sorted, I can solder the ends together to prevent any circuit breaks. And I did that 4 times with 2 blue noodles and 2 green noodles. And here's how they look all linked up together. So, now we have our lights rigged up, let's get them in place. I'm slotting in a thicker spine of armature wire into the centre of the body of the sorcerer, so that I can have the lights attached to it and pointing outwards from him. It's then just a case of popping all the wires down below and tying the positive ends together to form one unit, and doing the same for all the negative wires. I can then slip a heat shrinking tube over each wire, hook them up to the battery power, and then use some heat to shrink down the tubes and secure them all in place. And then one last test to make sure I didn't break anything. Success! I'll wrap the light wire around the spine to lock them in place, trim the ends, and start shaping out where I want the lights to be going. The 2 extra noodles I have will be circulating in the middle of it all, basically making up the bulk of the explosion contact. It looks pretty mental. I'll then just pop his loose hands into place around the body, and then we'll move on to the final step, which will be creating the blast. So I'll just dot around some ripped up clumps of cotton balls, gluing them with some PVA and pulling the ends out to create this blasting smoke effect. This will not only help hide all of the unpleasant wiring in the centre, but it will also diffuse the lights enough to spread it out across the entire blast radius instead of just being concentrated in the centre. And that looks like a pretty legit explosive death. Now all that's left is sticking on our buoys and getting the base reattached. So I'll pop Lusat's little staff into the ground using some more of our thin wire to make it levitate. Then I'll get a slop of glue popped down onto the wood and spread it around before realising I made a big mistake in that I didn't cut a battery pack hole, so then I had to mop all that slop up and cut a battery sized hole into the base. Then I can reattach the base onto the wood using some glue, and then I can get our little dudes popped into place, and we're just about finished here, so let's take a look at what we've just done. Thanks so much for joining me in another weird episode of smashing 2 things together and hoping for the best. If you did enjoy today's episode, please be sure to drop the video a like, maybe a subscribe if you haven't already. And if you want to support the channel any further, I do have a Patreon. The link is on the screen and in the description. And that just leaves me to thank my beautiful patrons for continuing to support me in whatever it is that I'm doing. You guys truly are the Wingardiums to my Leviosas. See you next time.